In 1965, when Al Pacino was 25 years old and still years away from becoming a household name, something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A child was born and then vanished from official records within 72 hours, leaving behind only whispers in the Bronx neighborhood where Pacino's family lived, and a grief so profound that it would color every relationship he ever had afterward. The truth about what happened to that child has been carefully guarded by the Pacino family for nearly 60 years, but the few people who know the full story say it explains everything about the man who would become Michael Corleone, the darkness in his eyes that no amount of acting training could have created. If you remember when families kept secrets that could destroy them, when loss was something you carried alone because talking about it felt like betrayal, make sure you're subscribed. The stories we're uncovering aren't in any biography or magazine profile. They're the truths that shaped the people we thought we knew. The South Bronx in the mid-1960s was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, except for the things that families decided to keep hidden. Al Pacino was living in a cramped apartment on Longwood Avenue with his mother Rose and his grandparents, struggling to make it as an actor in a world that seemed designed to break people like him. He was working odd jobs between acting classes at the Herbert Berghof studio, carrying furniture, cleaning offices, doing whatever he could to afford the $15 weekly tuition that was his only path out of poverty. What nobody outside the immediate family knew was that Pacino had a girlfriend, a young woman named Maria Santos, who lived 3 blocks away. She was the daughter of Puerto Rican immigrants, working as a seamstress in the garment district while taking night classes to become a teacher. They had met at a neighborhood dance in the summer of 1964, and the connection was immediate and intense. Pacino, who was already developing the brooding intensity that would later make him famous, found in Maria someone who understood his dreams without mocking them. She believed he would make it as an actor when everyone else, including his own family, thought he was wasting his life. By the fall of 1964, Maria was pregnant. The news should have been cause for celebration, but in 1964, for 2 young people from traditional Catholic families with no money and uncertain futures, pregnancy outside marriage was a crisis that threatened to destroy everything. Pacino's mother Rose, who had raised him alone after his father left when he was 2 years old, was devastated by the news. She had worked her entire life to give her son opportunities she never had, and now he seemed determined to repeat the same patterns of poverty and struggle that had defined her existence. The pressure from both families was immediate and overwhelming. Marriage was discussed, but Pacino was barely making enough money to feed himself, let alone support a wife and child. Maria's parents were traditional and deeply religious, and the shame of having an unmarried pregnant daughter was more than they felt they could bear in their tight-knit community. The young couple wanted to find a way forward together, but the weight of family expectations and economic reality made that seem impossible. Maria gave birth on March 7, 1965, at Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx. The baby was a girl, 7 pounds and 3 ounces, with dark hair and eyes that one nurse later described as remarkably alert for a newborn. Pacino was there for the birth, holding Maria's hand through the labor, seeing his daughter for the first time with a mixture of awe and terror that would become familiar to him in his later roles as complicated fathers. For 72 hours, the baby girl had a name, though what that name was remains one of the family's most closely guarded secrets. Pacino held his daughter, fed her from a bottle when the nurses showed him how, experienced the overwhelming rush of love and responsibility that comes with holding your own child. Years later, people who worked with him on films like The Godfather would remark on how authentic his portrayal of fatherhood seemed, how he could convey complex emotions about protecting and loving children with absolute conviction. They didn't know they were watching a man channel real grief and loss. But even as Pacino was falling in love with his daughter, the adults in both families were making decisions about her future. Maria's parents had contacted Catholic charities and arranged for a private adoption. The reasoning was presented as practical and inevitable. Pacino and Maria were too young, too poor, too unprepared to raise a child. The baby deserved a stable home with 2 parents who could provide for her. Keeping her would mean condemning 3 people to poverty and struggle. The adoption was framed as an act of love, of putting the child's needs above their own desires. What made the situation particularly cruel was the speed with which everything happened. Maria was still recovering from childbirth when the social worker from Catholic charities arrived at the hospital. Pacino was working a shift at a moving company, trying to make enough money to buy formula and diapers when the baby was taken. By the time he returned to the hospital that evening, his daughter was gone. The adoption had been processed as a private arrangement, meaning that all identifying information was sealed. The couple who took the baby were described only as financially stable Catholics from New Jersey. Maria and Pacino would never know their names, never know where their daughter was being raised, never have any way to find her. The aftermath of losing his daughter nearly destroyed Al Pacino. Friends from that period describe him as being in a state of absolute despair, unable to eat or sleep, disappearing for days at a time. He stopped going to acting classes for nearly 3 months, and when he finally returned, his teachers noticed that something fundamental had changed in him. The lightness that had characterized some of his earlier performances was gone, replaced by a depth of sadness and intensity that made even simple scenes feel weighted with hidden pain. His relationship with Maria didn't survive the loss. They tried to stay together, tried to support each other through the grief, but every time they looked at each other, they saw the baby who wasn't there. Maria left New York in the summer of 1965, moving to California to live with relatives and start over somewhere without constant reminders of what she had lost. Pacino never saw her again. He later told friends that losing Maria and their daughter within a few months of each other felt like dying, like having everything that mattered ripped away while being forced to keep living. What most people don't understand about grief is that it doesn't just hurt in the moment, it changes the fundamental architecture of who you are. Pacino's loss at 25 created in him a conviction that love was dangerous, that letting people close meant setting yourself up for devastating pain. His later relationships with women, including his famously complicated connection with Diane Keaton, were shaped by this early trauma. He never married, never created a traditional family structure, and while he eventually had children with different partners, those relationships were marked by the same fear of commitment and loss that had defined him since 1965. When Al Pacino began studying method acting seriously in the late 1960s with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, he found a technique that seemed designed for someone carrying his particular kind of pain. The method requires actors to draw on their own emotional experiences to create authentic performances, to find real feelings within themselves that match what the character is experiencing. For Pacino, who was carrying an ocean of unprocessed grief about his lost daughter, the method became both an artistic technique and a form of therapy. The intensity that characterized all his greatest performances, the ability to convey profound loss and yearning with just a look or a gesture, came directly from his experience at 25. When he played Michael Corleone in The Godfather, torn between family loyalty and personal morality, he was channeling his own feelings about the family pressures that had taken his daughter. When he played Frank Serpico, an honest man betrayed by the systems that should have protected him, he was expressing his rage at a world where poverty and social expectations could tear a father from his child. Lee Strasberg, who became Pacino's mentor and father figure, recognized that his student was working through profound trauma. He encouraged Pacino to use that pain in his performances, but he also warned him about the dangers of never processing it outside of his work. The warning went unheeded. For decades, Pacino used acting as his primary way of dealing with the loss of his daughter, channeling his grief into characters rather than confronting it directly. It made for extraordinary performances, but it also meant he was constantly reopening wounds that never fully healed. Al Pacino's mother Rose carried her own crushing guilt about what happened in 1965. She had been the primary voice pushing for the adoption, convinced that it was the only practical option, but also motivated by her own fears about her son repeating the pattern of her life. Rose had been abandoned by Pacino's father when Al was just a toddler, left to raise a child alone with minimal support. She didn't want that life for her son, didn't want him trapped by fatherhood before he had a chance to become the person she believed he could be. But watching her son's grief and recognizing that she had contributed to it became a source of profound regret that Rose carried until her death in 1992.
Friends of the family later revealed that Rose often spoke about the granddaughter she never got to know, wondering who she had become, whether she was happy, whether she ever thought about the family that had given her up. Rose kept a small box of mementos from those 72 hours, items that Pacino didn't discover until after her death: a hospital bracelet with the baby's weight and birth time, a single photograph of Maria holding the infant, a blessing card from the Catholic Charities social worker. When Pacino found that box while going through his mother's belongings, the grief that he had been managing through his work came flooding back with overwhelming force. He was 52 years old, wealthy and famous, surrounded by people, and yet he felt exactly as he had at 25, helpless and heartbroken. He later described finding those mementos as one of the most painful experiences of his life, evidence that his mother had carried the same sadness he had but never felt able to talk about it. The Italian Catholic culture they came from didn't allow for that kind of emotional vulnerability, especially not between a mother and her adult son.
By the time adoption records began to be unsealed in many states during the 1990s, allowing adoptees and biological parents to potentially reconnect, Al Pacino was one of the most famous actors in the world. The daughter he had lost 30 years earlier would have been in her 30s, possibly with children of her own. Friends encouraged him to consider searching for her, hiring private investigators to navigate the sealed records and try to determine what had happened to the baby girl born at Lincoln Hospital in 1965. But Pacino couldn't bring himself to do it. The reasons were complex and deeply personal. Part of it was fear of disrupting his daughter's life. If she had been raised by loving adoptive parents, if she was happy and stable, what right did he have to appear and potentially destabilize everything she knew about herself? Part of it was protection of his own carefully constructed emotional walls. He had spent decades learning to manage the pain of losing her, finding her and potentially being rejected, or worse, discovering that her life had been difficult in ways that his absence had contributed to, seemed like more than he could bear. There was also the pragmatic concern about publicity. Any attempt to search for his daughter would inevitably become public knowledge, turned into tabloid fodder that would expose the most private pain of his life to global scrutiny. The daughter herself would be hounded by media, her privacy destroyed by the simple fact of being connected to Al Pacino. He couldn't do that to her, couldn't make her pay the price for his fame and his desire for connection. If you watch Al Pacino's filmography with knowledge of what happened in 1965, certain performances take on additional layers of meaning that are almost unbearable. His portrayal of Tony Montana in Scarface includes a scene where Tony talks about family and loyalty in a way that feels deeply personal. The rage and pain in his voice when he confronts his sister about her relationship choices isn't just acting. It's a man expressing feelings about family and protection and control that come from a place of unhealed trauma. In The Godfather Part 3, Michael Corleone's entire arc is about trying to reconnect with his estranged children and find redemption for a lifetime of mistakes. The scene where Michael confesses to his son about the pain of losing his family, of realizing too late what matters, was written by Francis Ford Coppola but performed by Pacino with an emotional authenticity that clearly drew from his own life. Critics praised the performance while having no idea they were watching a man work through genuine grief about the daughter he gave up. Even in later films like The Merchant of Venice, Pacino's portrayal of Shylock included moments focused on the pain of losing a daughter that felt shockingly raw and personal. The famous "Hath not a Jew eyes" speech, which is about demanding recognition of shared humanity, was performed by Pacino with an undercurrent of personal grief that elevated it beyond the text. He was speaking not just about religious discrimination, but about the universal experience of loss and the desperate need to be understood in your pain. Maria Santos, the young woman who gave birth to Pacino's daughter and then lost her to adoption, largely disappeared from public record after 1965. The few traces that exist suggest she moved to Los Angeles, completed her teaching degree, and spent her career working in inner-city schools. She married in her 30s, though whether she had other children remains unknown. The one confirmed fact is that she never spoke publicly about her relationship with Pacino or the daughter they lost. Friends who knew Maria in her later years described her as someone who carried a deep sadness that she rarely discussed. She apparently followed Pacino's career from a distance, seeing his films but never attempting to contact him. There was one incident in the late 1980s when she apparently attended a screening of Sea of Love in Los Angeles, sitting in the back of the theater and leaving before the lights came up. Whether she was there to see Pacino specifically or simply happened upon the film is unknown. What is known is that Maria kept the same secret as Pacino, never telling her later husband or close friends about the baby she had given up. The shame and grief associated with that loss in 1965 was something she carried alone, just as Pacino did. They had been two kids trying to navigate impossible circumstances, and both had paid a price that lasted their entire lives. The daughter who connected them was also the thing that separated them forever, making any reunion too painful to contemplate. The most haunting aspect of this story is imagining the perspective of the daughter herself, a woman now approaching 60 years old who may or may not know that her biological father is one of the most famous actors in cinema history. If she was told she was adopted, if she knows her birth date and place, a simple internet search could reveal the truth. Or she might have grown up believing her adoptive parents were her biological family, never knowing there was any other story. Several people over the years have claimed to be Pacino's long-lost daughter from his time in the Bronx. None of these claims have been verified, and Pacino has never publicly acknowledged any of them. The legitimate daughter, if she exists and knows her history, has apparently chosen to maintain the same privacy that her biological parents did. Perhaps she has no interest in connecting with a famous father who gave her up. Perhaps she has her own family and life, and sees no reason to complicate it with a past that can't be changed. Or perhaps she doesn't know, and this entire story exists in a strange liminal space where the truth is known to only a handful of elderly people who were there in 1965. In that case, she might be reading this right now, pieces clicking together, realizing that the sadness she sometimes saw in her adoptive parents' eyes when she asked about her origins was because they knew they were raising the child of a man who would become famous. The not knowing, for both Pacino and his daughter, might be the most painful part of all. Rose Pacino died with that guilt weighing on her. Maria's parents, who pushed strongly for the adoption, reportedly spent their later years wondering if they had made the right choice. The daughter grew up not knowing her biological family's medical history, cultural background, or the reasons why she was given up. Pacino spent 60 years carrying grief that he felt unable to share with most of the people in his life. This kind of secrecy was typical of the era. In the 1960s, adoption was often treated as something shameful that needed to be hidden, as if acknowledging it would somehow harm everyone involved. Birth mothers were expected to forget their children and move on with their lives. Adoptive parents were encouraged to never tell children the truth about their origins. Birth fathers were often excluded from the process entirely, their rights and feelings considered irrelevant. The modern understanding of adoption acknowledges that secrecy causes more harm than it prevents, that adoptees have a right to know their origins, and that birth parents often carry lifelong grief that needs to be acknowledged and processed. But for people of Pacino's generation, those enlightened attitudes came too late. They made decisions based on the values and pressures of their time, and then had to live with the consequences for decades. Now in his 80s, Al Pacino has occasionally hinted at the existence of children beyond the three he acknowledged publicly. In interviews, when asked about fatherhood, he sometimes pauses in ways that suggest he's thinking about more than just his known children. Friends close to him have confirmed that he thinks often about the daughter he lost in 1965, wondering who she became, whether she's had a good life, whether she ever thinks about the parents who gave her up. The tragedy is that even now, with both of them in the final chapters of their lives, the barriers to connection seem insurmountable. The years of silence have created a distance that might be impossible to bridge. What would he even say to her if they met? How do you explain to a 60-year-old woman that you thought about her every day but never tried to find her? How do you convey 60 years of grief and love to someone who is a complete stranger? The daughter he lost influenced every role he played, every relationship he had, every decision he made about how to live his life. She is present in his greatest performances, the ghost behind his eyes, the source of the depth and sadness that made him one of cinema's most compelling actors. But she remains unknown to him, a person who exists somewhere in the world carrying half his DNA and none of his memories. The space between what is and what might have been is the true tragedy of Al Pacino's life. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think about the losses we all carry and the secrets that shape families across generations, share it with someone who understands that the people we see on screen are carrying their own hidden pain. These are the truths that matter, the human experiences behind the fame. And for those of you who lived through the 1960s, who remember when adoption meant permanent separation and grief was something you bore in silence, you know this story isn't unique to Al Pacino. It's the story of countless families torn apart by poverty and shame, and the belief that love alone wasn't enough to keep parents and children together.